Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I got another 6-album roundup for you guys, and this set of albums is sort of leans a little bit more towards the eclectic side than normal. Some of these albums surprised me. They seem like a little bit of a divergence from what I expected from these artists, but still a lot of great stuff worth checking out. So let's go and get started. First one I got up is Fleet Foxes, Shore. Now, in 2011, Fleet Foxes' Helplessness Blues was my first official 2011 album of the year, and that album really resonated with me. There was a lot of topics and a lot of musicality that connected with my experiences from that year. And in 2017, the follow-up, Crack Up, also was a top 20 album, but didn't resonate with me quite as much. It was a little bit more of a darker, more experimental affair, and didn't really connect with me quite the same way. Now, the recording for Shore started happening in 2017, right after Robin Pecknold had come off tour from Crack Up, and he was aware that Crack Up was a little bit darker album than Fleet Foxes were known for, and kind of wanted to get back to a little bit more brighter feel. So he was starting to get some traction in this album right in 2020 whenever lockdowns happened due to coronavirus. So he started having some difficulty with maintaining this bright feel until he came up with the perspective of life in the face of darkness, right? He wanted to provide sort of a hopeful feel in contrast to the world around him at the time. It wasn't until he started taking drives out into the Catskill Mountains on a daily basis to free him from this feeling of isolation and provide him with the inspiration for the lyrics. Overall, I feel like this is a really successful album for the Fleet Foxes. And again, I think if the intention was a return to form, I think this album kind of gets there. Okay, next up I got Mauritz Duda's Afraid. In addition to being the lead singer and bass player and general musical conjurer for mainstay progressive rock band Riverside, Mauritz Duda also has maintained a solo career on the side under the guise of Lunatic Soul. So when he started releasing albums under his own name, you have to wonder, like, what's the point? What could be said in a third identity that hasn't already been said within the parameters of his other projects? Well, this album, spelled with all capital letters, AFR AI D, is effectively an instrumental electronic album, which is a divergence. Again, even though Lunatic Soul has always had electronic components to it, this is kind of more of a really specific minimalist kind of electronica in the vein of things like, Vangelis and Michael Oldfield and Tangerine Dream. However, although it presents itself as an instrumental electronica, it does have a smattering of physical, organic instruments. There's some guitar work in there, and this provides it with moments that kind of feel like David Gilmour inspired music, like the Pink Floyd's 80s period, or even Kate Bush. Now, Duda has often been referred to as the Polish Steven Wilson, and I think that's kind of a justifiable comparison. He's very prolific, and he really composes music in the same melancholic progressive rock vein as Steven Wilson does. This album also shows the way in which he has a side of his personality that aligns itself with this more electronic style. Steve Wilson has always had electronic music in his background, even though he's best known for his work with Porcupine Tree. Porcupine Tree started off as an electronic music project. So this just kind of reinforces that comparison in some ways. And also, this album is meant to be a concept album, even though it's mostly presents itself as instrumental. And it's an album that's supposed to address our increasing anxiety with our relationship with computers and AI. And in this way, it's kind of programmatic because it's using electronica to comment on this relationship. It's almost like he's working through this relationship with electronica and computer music in real time as he's talking about this new phase of our relationship with technology. And this album kind of took me off guard too, because I wasn't really expecting it to be a fully instrumental endeavor. And it's kind of an interesting facet to Mauritz Duda that I had not really considered too much. And this album has really opened up my acceptance of that side of his compositional interests. Okay, next up I got Lyle Workman's Built to Last. This is another album that kind of took me off guard because his previous album to this one, Uncommon Measures, was this really fascinating orchestral rock hybrid album that for me in 2021 was a really kind of underrated gem. But I wanted to give it another shot at a top 20 album this year, and when I got this album I was a little bit surprised to find out that although there is a smattering again of these kind of orchestral flourishes, it's actually generally a guitar rock album. At first I found this a little bit disappointing, but once I framed it within the concept of it being an instrumental rock guitar album, it kind of won me over. And that's because I listened to a lot of instrumental guitar rock albums in the late 80s and early 90s. And this album kind of fits in that same vein. Lyle Workman is an extremely prolific player was a sideman starting off his career with Bourgeois Tag, and then has made film scores and played as a sideman on multiple projects with some really, really big names. But on this album, he really kind of explores two poles of instrumental music. On the one end, he's looking at the kind of almost jazz fusion style of rock music that was coming out in the late 70s, is exemplified in my mind by like Bill Bruford's Rock Goes to College period, where he was doing some work with Allen Holdsworth. But on the other side, it's almost like a Texas blues guitar album in the vein of like Stevie Ray Vaughan or ZZ Top. So when you think about this spectrum that he's working on, the closest kind of comparison that you could come up with would be an Eric Johnson. And that's because back in the late 80s and early 90s, I was listening to a lot of Eric Johnson, listening to a lot of these kind of instrumental rock guitar. Surfing with the Alien was one that kind of exemplifies that whole thing. And although this isn't really an album that's in that style, certainly there's a method and a structure to an instrumental guitar album that can make it interesting. And that's one of the things that album and this album have in common. And next up I got Inui's Murmuration. Inui's instrumentation of two vocalists, a keyboardist and a drummer, should attract the attention of those of you who are interested in the band The Nels that I covered from a couple years ago. Now, The Nels was a progressive rock band that replaced the idea of a lead singer with very tightly composed soprano trio. And like that, there's no singular lead singer for Inui. Instead, there's two female lead singers. But in contrast to the Nels, rather than having like three-part tightly composed soprano vocals, you have two vocalists that are really employing doubled unisons and complex hocketing between the two vocals and a few tight, distant harmonizations just to make things interesting. The resulting style sort of has some relationship to throat singing styles that you'd hear from like Northeast Asia or Northwestern First People styles of music. Now, although the instrumentation is relatively straightforward with just the quartet, the arrangements really are anything but. The compositional structures are really richly complex and emotionally delivered. And while there are traces of jazz and electronica, Inui's music has a real primality to it that hints at their deeper inspirations. The depth and the variety of these songs raises another question. Is Murmuration an EP or is it a proper album? It's got a 20-minute runtime, okay? But there's 5 songs in there, I think 6. And the diversity of these songs and the kind of narrative thread that holds them together gives it the feel of being an actually full album. So, an album's status as an album or an EP for me is sometimes kind of flexible. This really, to me, even though it's got a short runtime, it feels like a full album. Okay, next up I got Joe Howe's Debossed. So on a very cold night in 2011, I went and saw Deerhoof play, and their opening band was this group called Ben Butler and Mousepad. It's this amazing duo with like a very satiric and quirky approach to keyboard music that I really like connected with immediately. I was fascinated by their performance and literally was standing at the merch booth to meet the drummer and to buy their album from the very second he could get off stage. And the other member of this band was Joe Howe, the keyboard player. Now that album was formed for Fantasy, and it ended up being a big player for me in 2011. And I tried to follow Ben Butler and Mousepad for a little bit after that, but they kind of dissolved, and I lost track of them until this album showed up to me on a Bandcamp recommendation, and I kind of connected the dots to find out that Joe Howe, although he's been off my radar, has been very prolific in the time since I saw him on that very cold night in Austin. He's created a variety of music and a variety of names and a variety of different projects, dipping into jazz and soundtracks and even like an installation work. Debossed, however, has more of a connection, I think, with the work he was doing with Ben Butler and Mousepad. It's very quirky, and it carries this tone of intellectualism, but never loses its sense of play. My youngest son actually is really disturbed by this album because it's so angular and so kind of disorienting that every time it comes on, he feels like that something's wrong with my player. He says that your player's glitching, Dad. And I have to explain to him, no, that's the music. And so he feels like that Joe Howe is tricking him. But not too soon after that, he adjusts and starts like flailing about crazily with the music and enjoying it. So again, there's something that's really fun about it, that once you get past its sort of disorienting exterior, is really fun to listen to. Okay, and finally I got up Sleepytime Gorilla Museum's Of the Last Human Being. This one's just plain weird. Okay, Sleepytime Gorilla Museum is known for being in the same kind of vein of music as Mr. Bungle and Secret Chiefs 3, and I could totally see that. As a matter of fact, I feel like this is what would happen if Tom Waits was singing lead for Secret Chiefs 3. It's bizarre, and it has this very kind of cabaret, post-apocalyptic cabaret feel, and perhaps might even be a concept album. Still kind of digging through the lyrics, but it has a sense that an arc that talks about the rise and fall of mankind, told from the perspective of people who feel like they're sort of on the end game of it. I could almost picture this ragged vaudevillian group traveling the wasteland after a terrible apocalypse, talking about the end of mankind, and this being that soundtrack, this almost a stage play. It's got that kind of theatricality to it. Not for the faint of heart, because this music, this weird, doesn't really reveal itself on the first or second listen, but there's depth to it, I think, that's worth checking out, and certainly a lot of musicality that lies beneath the surface that implies an artistic vision beyond what you're just seeing here, I think, objectively. That's all I got for you this time around. So if you like this post, please like and subscribe, share out with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. I'm putting tracks up from all these songs over in a master Spotify playlist. You should go check that out. And if you want to be involved in my year-end Best of 2024 Viewers' Choice Bracket, please sign up for my Patreon below. And until you see you next time, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.